Before I begin, I would like to thank once more Feras and the other organizer of this wonderful initiative, the Gotha Manuscript Talks, Konrad Hirschler, who unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight, but we keep him in our mind and our thoughts. Now, the talk of my paper, as Feras already announced, is Kuttābīya, Kuttāb, Mukattibūn, Stocking Sultanic Libraries in Late Mamluk Cairo. Now, the subtitle is pretty much self-evident. I'm going to talk about late Mamluk Sultanic libraries. And by this, of course, I am referring to the two towering figures of that later period, which is Qāytbāy and Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī, first sultan ruling from 1468 to 1496, and the second one from 1501 to 1516. Now, as it happens, we are pretty well informed about their libraries by virtue of my own work. I must put it as it is. For the first sultan, Qāytbāy, we have a forthcoming article by myself, which with a rather dull title, A Preliminary Hand List of Manuscripts from the Library of Qāytbāy. And in this article, I give a hand list of some 130 manuscripts that once belonged to the library of Qāytbāy. Now, as for Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī, as already explained by Feras, I have my first monograph published in 2021, browsing through the Sultan's bookshelves. And in this book, I detail some 135 manuscripts that once belonged to Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī. Now, if at the end of this talk, you still haven't had enough of Sultanic manuscripts, I invite you to check out my academia page, because in the meantime, I have identified at least 23 new manuscripts that belonged to the same Sultan. So I keep posting regular updates on my academia page, so please check it out. Anyway, so for Qāniṣawh, we have 135 plus 23 manuscripts. For Qāytbāy, we have 130. That gives us a rough total of 290 manuscripts. This is the corpus that we can use when we try and talk and think about the late Mamluk Sultanic libraries. Now, a corpus of 290 manuscripts, you can ask that a lot of questions. You can start wondering about the titles included, or the people who authored these titles, or the genres represented in these libraries, or the languages in which these works were written. But I'm going to address another question. Whose pen are we looking at? Because we are talking, of course, about a pre-print era, so each book in these libraries was handwritten. By whom were these books written? Now, there is, of course, a small group of holographs, so copies of texts that are written by the author of the text himself. Of course, we have some of those in the Sultanic libraries. Oftentimes, authors would delegate the work to the Sultan and submit a copy in their own handwriting to the Sultan's library in order to curry favor or whatever. But I'm not going to address the issue of holographs. What I will be addressing thus are the non-holographic manuscripts that ended up in late Mamluk Sultanic libraries. Who copied them? And if we look at the verb copying, the verb that comes to mind in this context is kataba. That's probably one of the first verbs that you learn when you study Arabic as a foreign language. Kataba means to write. But we have to make clear that kataba, to write, can be a bit ambiguous as it does in English. By kataba, I only mean to the physical act of writing, not to authoring or composing. So in English, that can be a bit confusing and ambiguous. Now, Arabic has a broad range of verbs used to express the idea of authoring or composing a text, but mostly the verb kataba is not included in that range. So in this present context, kataba only means to copy, the physical act of copying, and does not to author or to compose a title. Even today in secondary literature, you still find this misunderstood, as if the kātib of a particular manuscript would also be the author of that text, which is not the case. So kataba, copying. Another common verb is nasakha, but in the present context, it's only kataba. Now, who is involved in the act of kitaba, in the act of copying manuscripts for the Sultanic libraries. In all, I have identified 3 groups, which I tentatively have called Kuttābīya, Kuttāb, and Mukattibūn. Now, as you can see, these 3 terms all derive from the same verbal root of kataba, of copying. It is pretty much a case of what is called tajnis ishtikaki, etymological paronomasia. So you play with words because of their similarity. And here the similarity is, of course, informed by the fact that they derive from the same verbal root. Now, for Mukattibūn and for Kuttāb, that's okay. For Kuttābīya, there's a bit of a problem, but I couldn't resist this wordplay. But I'll return to Kuttābīya later on, why that is a problem. Anyway, we have these 3 groups all involved in the act of kitaba, of copying manuscripts. And they all feed into one another. It's pretty much a circular movement. We will see that some of these Kuttābīya, they turn into Kuttāb. These Kuttāb were also active often as Mukattibūn, and these Mukattibūn, they trained the next generation of Kuttābīya. So we have a circular movement, and as such, it doesn't really matter where we take the plunge and start our exploration of this circle, but perhaps it's best to start with the simplest group, and that is the group of the Kuttāb. Now, first group, Kuttāb, that's a plural of kātib, that means a scribe, a copyist. And here we see a first colourful of a manuscript that comes from the library of Sultan Qāytbāy. Katabahu al-Abd al-Fakir ilallah ta'ala Muhammad ibn Sudun al-Tasrawi. So this was copied, kataba, not written or authored, copied by the poor servant Muhammad ibn Sudun al-Tasrawi. Now, just to point out, that's quite interesting. You have here the colophon that all looks very nice, all very shiny, but eventually, in the end, it's a shitty colophon because it doesn't say where and when the manuscript was actually copied. And you often see that in these Sultanic manuscripts. The colophons look very nice, but they are very poor indeed. But what to take from here is this manuscript was copied by Muhammad ibn Sudun al-Tasrawi. And he was one of those Kuttāb, those professional scribes, towards the end of the 15th century in Cairo. And of course, he was not alone in this. I have identified a list of professional scribes who helped stocking the libraries of Qāytbāy and Qāniṣawh. Now, for the first group, we have, for example, al-Babi, Umar al-Zanjawi, and al-Farnawi. Those were active under the rule of Sultan Qāytbāy, with al-Farnawi, for example, the most popular copyist, with 7 copies included in Qāytbāy's library. Now, by the end of the reign of Qāytbāy, these people had passed away, so you don't find their work in the library of the next Sultan, al-Ashraf Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī. Then you have an intermediate group of al-Fayyumi and al-Arach as-Sumbati. These people were active during both reigns of the Sultan, so you find their work in both their libraries. Al-Arach as-Sumbati, for example, copied 2 texts for Qāytbāy and 7 at least for al-Ashraf Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī. So al-Farnawi was the most important copyist for Qāytbāy, and al-Arach as-Sumbati was the most important one for al-Ashraf Qāniṣawh. And then the last group are people who started working only during the reign of al-Ashraf Qāniṣawh, so you don't find their work in the previous period. People like Muhammad al-Azraqi. Now, most of these scribes are pretty well known. You find some information in rich Mamluk sources. We know who they studied with. We know who they taught. So we can pretty much reconstruct these schools of calligraphy in late Mamluk Cairo. Doris Berens Abu Saif, for example, has worked on that. We also have specimens of their penmanship of each of these people, often more than you see on this list. Al-Arach as-Sumbati, for example, has 2 manuscripts for Qāytbāy, 7 for Qāniṣawh. But apart from that, I know of at least 13 other manuscripts. So we have quite a decent corpus to work with. Just 2 quick examples. On the left is the colophon of a splendid volume in the Chester Beatty Library, a geomantic volume. It was actually not commissioned by the Sultan, but by an important official, Yashbak bin Mahdi. You see that on the top. It was copied, kitaba, by al-Farnawi, and after the death of the commissioner of Yashbak bin Mahdi, the manuscript ended up with Sultan Qāytbāy. And once more, there's no place of copying, there's no date of copying. On the right, you have another example by a professional scribe, al-Umari, al-Shāfi'ī, al-Muqaddasī. And I show this, and I would like you to keep this in mind. There are two aspects worth pointing out. First of all, it's rather cramped writing. There's a lot of words on the page. That shouldn't surprise us, of course. If you're familiar with Arabic or Islamic manuscripts, you are used to long texts and many words on the page. And this is a very good example of that, but keep that in mind. And we are going to compare that with something that comes up. Another thing to keep in mind is the fact that this is a pristine manuscript. There are big margins for lots of marginal comments and paratextual elements, but there are none. So that is also typical for these Sultanic manuscripts. Hardly any of them shows any trace of usage or wear. It is as if they have been copied and then stored away on the library bookshelf, never to be used again. And if they were used, well, that must have been done with the utmost care. That's also quite typical for these Sultanic manuscripts. Now, I could go on about each of these professional scribes, but instead, I want to focus briefly on my pet scribe, my favorite scribe. I am somewhat of a nerd, so I have my favorite scribe for the late 15th century, and that is Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Ṭayyibī al-Azhari al-Shāfi'ī. Now, why is he my favorite one? For the very simple reason that there's something strange going on with this person. Strange in the following sense. Today, he's rather popular, he's rather well known by virtue of a celebrated manual of calligraphy that he wrote. You see the front cover there, written in 1502 and dedicated to, or at least ex libris Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī, the second Mamluk Sultan. A very well-known manual, at least among people working on Islamic calligraphy and paleography, obviously not famous as in Instagram famous or whatever, so famous, but today, unlike in his own day. If you look at the Mamluk sources of the late 15th century, rich as they may be, you don't find any trace of this al-Ṭayyibī, celebrated as he may be today. But I'm lying a little bit. There's only one trace of him, a very short entry in the important biographical dictionary of as-Sakhawi, ad-Daw al-Lami, but the entry is frustratingly short. All that as-Sakhawi shares with us is the fact that al-Ṭayyibī came from a family of scholars, which is pretty self-obvious, and second, that his family name is to be pronounced al-Ṭayyibī and not al-Ṭayyibī or al-Tibī. Now, that is frustratingly little information, obviously. Now, and that was pretty much the status of what we knew about this al-Ṭayyibī until recently. Now, I wondered, because this person authored an important manual on calligraphy, surely he must have been active as a scribe himself. And indeed, when you start digging, you come up with a whole range of manuscripts written by this al-Ṭayyibī, by this calligrapher. I have given the years of those manuscripts that can be dated, all by the hand of al-Ṭayyibī. So you see his first appearance already in 1461 with a manuscript that ended up in the library of Sultan Khushqadam, which was a predecessor of Sultan Qāytbāy, obviously. 1473, a manuscript for Qāytbāy. 1502, the manual for Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī, etc., and so forth. So you see this person active well over a period of 40 years as a professional scribe. He copied manuscripts that ended up in the library of the Sultan, but he also made a living by selling manuscripts to others. This is a nice example. This is the colourful of a manuscript that contains al-Busīri's al-Kawākib the Mantle Ode, a very famous poem, highly popular in the Mamluk days. On the top panel, you see that min kitabat Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Ṭayyibī, so copied by our person al-Ṭayyibī. And on the central panel, perhaps you can read it, is Khidmat Ahmad al-Qādiri. That means that this manuscript was purchased by Ahmad al-Qādiri from al-Ṭayyibī and then given as a gift, an act of rendering service to somebody we don't know exactly who it is. But anyway, just to point out that al-Ṭayyibī was making a living as a professional scribe. Perhaps one more thing to point out here is the provenance of this particular manuscript. It comes from the Astani Quds library, which is in Mashhad, Iran, And I'm highlighting this just to point out, that this is one of the major challenges, of course, when you try and reconstruct the libraries of these Mamluk sultans. These libraries are no longer existent, so all the manuscripts have dispersed and scattered across the globe. And the first major challenge, of course, is to try and identify as many manuscripts as possible. And that takes you to all sorts of places, including a very unexpected Astani Quds library in Mashhad, Iran. Now, 1488, al-Ṭayyibī wrote a small text, probably dedicated to the Atabak al-Asakir, who was a high official at the time. It was not a manual of calligraphy per se, but it was a collection of specimens of, I think, 11 different scripts, 11 aklam, 11 pens, Rika, Thulth, Nask, Musalsal, etc., and so forth. And also this one, Kalam Ta'liq, so the Ta'liq script. And as you can see on the top, what Kātibīhi, as invented by the author. So this is ostensibly a new script that was invented by al-Ṭayyibī himself, a Ta'liq script, and that was used merely for one purpose, for writing petitions. And rather than producing a model petition or a dummy petition, al-Ṭayyibī thought it was a nice idea to include an actual petition in this work, a petition in his own name, dedicated to the Atabak al-Asakir. You see here on the top, as always in petitions, you see al-Mamluk and then his name, Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Ṭayyibī. He refers to himself as al-Mamluk, the Mamluk, but of course this is not to be understood in the technical meaning of the word as a military slave, but merely as your humble servant. And then towards the end, we find the actual su'al, the question, the petition. He asks to be appointed to a vacant position in an unnamed hospital, probably the Mansouriya hospital, but that's a different story. What we should take from here is that while al-Ṭayyibī was working as a kātib, as a scribe, he was also, he had to make ends meet, of course, he was also finding other jobs to make ends meet, including some position in a hospital. Now, in his celebrated 1502 manual, published 3 times in the meantime, we find the same. We find another petition, once more in the Ta'liq script, once more supposedly invented by himself. And once more, it is not a model petition. He has inserted an actual petition in his own name, now directed not to the Atabak al-Asakir, but to the Sultan himself, al-Ashraf Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī. Once more on top, we have the name of the author himself, al-Mamluk Muhammad ibn Hassan. But what is interesting here, we find a job that he already has, and that is Mu'adib al-Mamalik bi-Tabakat al-Rafraf al-Kubra. So in 1502, he was already active as an instructor, as a teacher in one of the military schools of the Sultan. And here towards the end of the petition, we find the actual question, the su'al. He asked the Sultan to be appointed as a mu'adib, as an instructor, not in one of the military schools, but in the Gavriya, in the Sultan's own madrasa complex. So he's not really looking for a new job, he's looking for another place to perform the same function, a more prestigious position, not one of the 10 to 14 military schools, but the Sultan's own madrasa complex. So what we learned from this petition is that scribes, including the Ṭayyibī, were also active as a mu'adib or a mukattib or mu'alim, or however you want to call it, as an instructor, as a teacher in an educational institution such as a military school. And al-Ṭayyibī was not alone, so let's take a look at these mukattibūn or instructors. Here we have a second colophon, now if I'm not mistaken, one I think also taken from a manuscript that belonged to Sultan Qāytbāy. And we read, خدمة المملوك بردبك من عبد الكريم من طبقة الأشرفية تلميذ عبد القادر الخضري. So this manuscript was written by a Mamluk called Burdubak min Abdul Karim, who was stationed at the Tabaka, at the military school of the Ashrafiyya, and he was a tilmith, a pupil of Abdul Qadir al-Khidri. So this Abdul Qadir al-Khidri was a scribe, a kātib, also active as a mukattib or an instructor, as was al-Ṭayyibī, and as were many others. In the list you see, for example, al-Farnawi again, that was the most popular copyist of Qāytbāy's library with 7 copies. He was also teaching others how to write, teaching others calligraphy. And just to give two examples, these are two works written by Mamluks. I will return to that later on, and they are both pupils of the same instructor, the same Mukattib, al-Sayfī. On the left, we have a Quran written by al-Mamluk Qāytbāy, a pupil tilmīz of al-Sayfī. And on the right, we have another copy of al-Busīri's Mantle Ode, one kept in Dallas. And now this is the Khidmat. This is copied by a Mamluk called Janim, once more a pupil of Sayfī. So we have kātibs, copyists working as Mukattibūn, working as instructors, and who were they instructing exactly? Now we have seen two colophons, and here we have a third one. Take a look. كتبه المملوك Qāniṣawh min al-Sharīfī min tabakat al-Rafraf bil-Hawsh Sharif al-Maliki al-Ashrafī. So this was copied, katabahu, by a Mamluk called Qāniṣawh min al-Sharīfī min tabakat al-Rafraf, of the military school of the Rafraf, etc. and so forth. So we have already seen three colophons, and they say katabahu of kitabat or khidmat al-Mamluk, and then a personal name. So we have Mamluks making copies of manuscripts that end up in Sultanic libraries. Now, before we continue, I think it's worthwhile to say a few words about the Mamluk institution as a whole, because otherwise it will be a bit difficult to understand what or who are Mamluks. Well, Mamluk means literally, well, owned or possessed, and it's a technical term for a military slave. These people were imported from outside the Mamluk Sultanate, from the non-Islamic world, obviously, because you cannot make a Muslim a slave, so they had to come from non-Islamic regions. They were then sold on slave markets, and quite some of them were obviously purchased by the Sultan, and the Sultan then put up his Mamluks in military schools or barracks, which is called the Tabaka, plural Tibak. There were 10 to 14 Tibak in Cairo. And there they enjoyed a training that consisted of a military and a non-military half. The military half, yeah, they learned how to shoot a bow, use a sword, ride a horse, and wrestle and things like that. But there was also a non-military half to that curriculum. These non-Muslims, of course, had to be converted to Islam, and that meant they had to learn the basic tenets of Islamic faith, of Islamic law. They had to learn how to read and write Arabic. They had to learn a bit of Quran and things like that. At the end of their training in this military school, these slaves were manumitted. They were set free by the Sultan as their manumitting master. But even after that manumission, at least in theory, these Mamluks retained a master-servant relationship with the manumitting master, with the Sultan. But anyway, so we have here these Mamluks, these military slaves who are purchased by the Sultan, who are being trained inside these barracks, inside these military schools, and they appear to be producing manuscripts that end up in the library of the Sultan. Now, that's a bit of a strange phenomenon, and Barbara Fleming was the first one to call attention to this. Barbara Fleming is a German scholar who passed away a few years ago, wrote an important article on this, literary activities in Mamluk halls and barracks, published in 1977. I know that because that's the year of my birth. Anyway, she had a very small corpus of 13 manuscripts to work with, and she noticed that these were all strikingly similar to one another. They were always written in very plain, very simple, very legible naskh. The hand in which it was written, the dictus, was clearly unexperienced, not a scholarly hand, but very unexperienced, a novice hand. The texts in these manuscripts were, as a rule, always short, and the topics dealt with were mostly non-technical, so no heavy tafsir or philosophy, but mostly what we might say, more popular religious kind of stuff, devotional texts, prayers, and things like that. And all these manuscripts were signed by Mamluks, katabahu al-Mamluk, as you see on the colophon, who state his name, Qāniṣawh min al-Sharīfī, and the military school at which he is stationed. Here we have the Tabakat al-Rafraf. Now, that was the the set of manuscripts she worked with, and she came to the conclusion that this is a source of text production that was apparently peculiar to the Mamluk institution. That was her observation in 1977, and that observation still holds. This source of manuscript production is indeed peculiar to the Mamluk Sultanate. Now the question is, of course, what was Barbara Fleming looking at? What are we looking at? Barbara asks herself that same question, and she hypothesized perhaps that we are dealing with school exercises or with graduation copies. I will return to that later on. Now, as a whole, I think that the hypothesis of Barbara Fleming and her observations still holds. There are, however, some questions to be answered, and I will try and answer that in the remainder of my talk. So when, by whom, what, curriculum, what do these manuscripts teach us about the agency of Mamluks? What about the educational level? Things like that. But before I do that, first, a very plain, very average, very good example of a so-called graduation copy. Here you see the colophon at the end of the manuscript. Once more, we already know that. Min kitabat al-Mamluk misrbay min Qāniṣawh min tabakat zimamiyya. So this text is copied by a Mamluk called Misrbay min Qāniṣawh of the tabaka of the military school of the Zimamiyya. Here we have the title page of the manuscript, Kitab fi Mu'jizat al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and then Birasm Maulana al-Makam Sharif Sultan al-Malik al-Ashraf Abi Nasr Qāytbāy. So this manuscript clearly ended up in the library of Mr. Bay's manumitting master, the Sultan Abu Nasr Qāytbāy. And here we have a sample of the body of the text, and that is why I asked you to keep in mind that image of a text written by a professional scribe, densely written, crammed writing, lots of words on the page. Here we have something completely else. There's a huge interlineation, and even here, well, it's not that big here, but sometimes it's even bigger. We have very few words per page. And if you consider the fact that this text, this manuscript, only consists of 23 folios, you understand that this is a very, very short text indeed, especially considering the ratio of words per page. 23 folios, a very short text. And also the topic is interesting, Mu'jizat al-Nabi, so miracles wrought by the Prophet Muhammad. That is a very typical topic that you find in these graduation copies. Nothing too fanciful, nothing too technical, but devotional and highly religious. Now, questions, when? Barbara Fleming worked with a corpus, and the oldest manuscript there dated from the reign of Sultan Qāytbāy, but it would seem that we have to push back the date of this peculiar phenomenon a bit further. I have one graduation copy identified for the period before 1438, before the rule of Jaqmaq. So that is a manuscript copied by a Mamluk who was not yet manumitted, and that ended up in the library of the Sultan. We have more manuscripts copied by Mamluks, but they do not meet all these criteria of a graduation copy. On the Jaqmaq, we already have 8 such graduation copies, and then we see the numbers rising. Under Qāytbāy, we have 30 manuscripts out of 130 that are graduation copies, and with Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī, we have a staggering 78 graduation copies out of a total of 157. That means that half of the library of Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī, at least to the extent that we have reconstructed this thus far, half of the library were graduation copies penned by his own Mamluks who were still being trained inside the military school. So no important or well-known professional scribes, be it in or outside the Mamluk Sultanate, but his own simple military slaves. Next question, by whom? We say that, okay, these graduation copies are made by the Sultan's Mamluks, by the Sultan's military slaves, but that is a very broad, very generic term. There were very many Mamluks, and there were various types of Mamluks, and they each come with a very own technical vocabulary and technical designation. So perhaps Could we try and make this generic term of Mamluk a little bit more specific? And then the word Kuttābīya comes to mind. I have used that in my title, as I said, Kuttābīya Mukattibūn. Kuttāb, I couldn't resist the paranomasia play with 3 words deriving from the same word kataba, but there could be a problem with Kuttābīya, and let me explain. According to William Popper, what are the Kuttābīya? They are student Mamluks, sultans Mamluks given special instruction in the barracks for their military and religious duties under an older Mamluk. So according to Popper, the Kuttābīya is pretty much a designation for an elite group of Mamluks of the Sultan. Perhaps those who were mentally or intellectually more gifted, and they were selected for special training in a Kuttāb in a school, hence the name Kuttābīya. And that, of course, would make perfect sense. Not all Mamluks producing graduation copies, but only the mentally gifted ones who were selected as Kuttābīya, being actively involved in the act of kitaba. It would make perfect sense. I agree. There's only one problem, that is that David Ayalon does not agree with that definition of Kuttābīya. I'm not going to read this French quotation in full, but the point that he's trying to make is that Kuttābīya has nothing to do with an elite group of Mamluks. For him, the Kuttābīya are Mamluks of a sultan, and when that sultan passes away, these Mamluks who are not yet manumitted, not yet set free, they are purchased by the next sultan. And so under the next sultan, they can continue their training and eventually get manumitted by that next sultan as their new master. For David Ayalon, that are the Kuttābīya, and now it doesn't really make sense anymore to tie this group to the so-called graduation copies. Now, to be sure, Kuttābīya in David Ayalon's reading is still deriving from the same verbal root of kataba, writing, of course, but he links it to the very specific legal term of kitaba, which is a contract between a master and a slave. So it's tempting to think that all these graduation copies were penned by a specific elite group called the Kuttābīya, but the evidence so far is inconclusive and it remains to be further investigated. But as I already admitted, I couldn't resist a nice paronomasio, so I simply went with Kuttābīya, but there's something not entirely sure about this. Now, next question, what are we looking at? Barbara Fleming asked herself already that same question, and she said perhaps school exercises or graduation copies. Now, school exercises, they certainly are not. For that, they are far too expensive. Paper is expensive. Considering the small number of words per page, well, that really doesn't make sense to think that these are school exercises. Lots of paper is being used for very few words. These things are bound into a volume, they are gilded and things like that. So certainly not school exercises. Graduation copies makes much more sense. So Mamluks, either towards the end of their training as a whole, or towards the end of their training, well, in terms of the non-military half of that curriculum, they might have produced a graduation copy to demonstrate the fact that they were able to read and write in Arabic, and that they had a legible, decent hand, at least in the simple script of Nasr. That all makes sense, but there are still some problems. I'm not going into details here. Only one example of such a problem that arises if you consider these 2 manuscripts. Once more, we see 2 colophons of Mamluks who produced a copy, both under the reign of Sultan al-Ashraf Qāniṣawh al-Ghawrī. Now, if you can read Arabic, you see that the colophons are exactly the same. Katabahul Mamluk mamai min bardi bak min tabakat al-hawsh. So these texts are written by a Mamluk called Mamai min bardi bak of the military school of the Haush. Now, of course, that's a problem because you normally graduate only once. So that is a problem. What are we dealing with? Now, one simple solution would be to assume that we are dealing with 2 namesakes, 2 doubles, that there are 2 Mamai min Bardibaks who happen to have studied at the same military school. That's possible, of course. Mamai is a very common Mamluk name. And second, as I said, these colophons are not dated, which means that there is a time span of 15 years, potential time span of 15 years between these two manuscripts. So we have 15 years, and perhaps there have been two barracks in the time span of 15 years in the same school. So dealing with two namesakes, it's possible that would help us, that would save the hypothesis of Barbara Fleming that we are dealing with graduation copies. On the other hand, if of course we are dealing with one and the same individual, that is a bit more problematic, but still that doesn't rule out the possibility that most of these manuscripts may have been graduation copies, and that apart from that, there was also another type of manuscript that we are not yet aware of. So that's all possible. Now, next item, shared curriculum across barracks, yes, but perhaps predilections. What do I mean by that? Well, if you take a look at all these graduation copies, you often find several copies of one and the same text. And often it seems that copies of the same text are actually written by Mamluks coming from the same military school. For example, here you have the same introduction. One is written by Yashbak of the Haush school, and the other one is written by Bulat of the same Haush school. So there seems to be a tendency here, it seems possible to say that some schools had certain predilections for certain texts to be copied by the Mamluks of that school, but that is not entirely the case, because sometimes you also find copies of texts written by Mamluks of different schools and not of the same school. So that is a bit of a question still. Important question, authorial agency. Now, these graduation copies by these Mamluks or by these Kuttābīya, to what extent were Mamluks free to decide what they were doing? Is there any agency involved? Were they free to decide which text to copy? Or if we are dealing with a selection of a longer text, were they free to make their own selection? Or was that selection already made in the model text that they were copying? It's all very tricky, very difficult. I was first very optimistic when I found this text in the Lalali library in the Süleymaniye in Istanbul, written by Janibak of the Haush. Now, the body of the text itself is not relevant here. Here we are looking at the introduction. And what do we see there in the red square? أحببت أن أهدي إلى خزانة مولانا المقام الشريف. I would very much like to present this manuscript to the treasury, to the library of my master, the Sultan. And I thought, well done, Jani, but this is your own authorial voice. So I was quite happy to find that quite unique, to hear and to read the Mamluk's own voice transpire through the lines of the text. But then I came across this manuscript kept hundreds of kilometers away at the Rashid Effendi library in Kayseri, also in Turkey, a text written by Ali Bai of the Zimamiyya. The body of the text is different from the other manuscript, but again, that's not very important. The introduction is entirely the same. So this Ali Bai also says, أحببت أن أهدي ذلك إلى خزانة شريفة المفلوية. He also wants his manuscript. He also would love his manuscript to be added to the library of his Sultan. And also the rest of the introduction is pretty much the same. So whenever you think that you have found or you are hearing the Mamluk's own authorial voice, well, you have to think twice. And that was quite disappointing. So you have to be very careful whenever you start thinking that you are onto something and that you find a Mamluk not just copying text, but also actively doing something himself with the text. That's very unfortunate. Until now, I think there's only one exception to this. I think there's one text in which we truly hear and read the Mamluk's own voice, and it's Fatih 3482, a text written by Burdubak, a Mamluk, of course. And what does he say in his introduction? It's something that I haven't found elsewhere so far. So I really think that these are Burdubak's own words. What does he say? وَمَنْ رَأَى فِيهِ غَيْرَ صَوَابٍ فَلْيَصُدَّهُ وَيُصْلِحَهُ وَيَقْبَلْ عُذْرِي فَإِنَّنِي رَجُلٌ تُرْكِي عَلَى كُلِّ حَالٍ. So whoever sees in this text of mine something that is incorrect, let him pass over this in silence, mend it silently, and accept my apology, for I am a Turk in every way. I haven't found this elsewhere. This seems very differential, and I think this is really These are really the words of Bourdoubac himself. So authorial agency, yes, slightly, we have to be very careful with that. One last thing, perhaps, educational level. Now, all these Mamluks, either the Kuttābīya as the elite group or Mamluks in general, they are producing these graduation copies. And of course, it makes sense that not everybody is reaching the same level. Mostly, you have Mamluks capable of producing one very simple, very neat naskh hand. It's very legible. It's a pleasure to read, but it's a bit dull, of course. That's the average level of Mamluks graduating. But sometimes you have the odd exception of people who were clearly talented for when it comes to calligraphy. Here, for example, we have Jan Bardi of the Zimamiyya barracks. As his graduation copy, he did not copy a single text. Instead, he decided to copy 6 short texts in 6 different calligraphic styles. So in Nasr, Dirga, in Fools, and also here, for example, in so-called chain script or musalsal script. And then on top of the bill is this manuscript by Barzbay of the Arba'ina school, a very nice manuscript kept at the Topkapi in Istanbul. The body of the text is in very plain and simple naskh as the text of Yashbak. Towards the end of the manuscript, we have the colophon, which we have seen before, written by Barzbay. But immediately preceding the colophon, we have this very interesting text. And you all recognize this, of course. This is a petition in Ta'liq script, the script invented by my pet kātib al-Ṭayyibī. Now, unlike al-Ṭayyibī, and that is a pity, Barzbay has not included an actual petition in his own name directed to the Sultan. It is a model petition. So the name of the addresser is left out, and there's no actual su'al, there's no actual question. But anyway, it's well done to Barzbay. He demonstrated the fact that not only he had mastered the basic naskh script, but was clearly capable also of mastering a far more intricate, far more difficult script, such as Ta'liq. There's a fair chance that Barzbay actually studied this script with al-Ṭayyibī. Now, to be fair, we don't know whether al-Ṭayyibī ever was an instructor at the Arba'ina, but that doesn't really matter. We know of Mamluks. Most Mamluks studied with instructors that were clearly associated with their own school, but we also know of Mamluks who studied with an instructor who was affiliated to another school. So it's well possible that Barzbay stayed at the Arba'ina school, yet studied with al-Ṭayyibī at the Rafraf school. It's all very possible. Now, by way of conclusion, I would like to draw your attention to my pen Kuttābī. As I said, I have a pen kātib. I also have a pen, a favorite Kuttābī, and that is Qayt al-Sharīfī. Now, why is he my favorite? Let me explain. Here on the left, we have his graduation copy, which is once more a copy of the Mantle Ode of al-Busīrī, which is probably the most often copied text in Mamluk times, al-Busīrī's Mantle Ode. A very simple graduation copy with a colophon at the end and things like that. Now, as with the case of other Mamluks, this is the only trace that we have of these Mamluks in history. They were not important enough at the time, and also later on, to be noticed or to be picked up by Mamluk sources, by chroniclers or biographers. And by the time they may have reached a social rank high enough to be noticed by these chroniclers, while the Mamluk Sultanate was no more. So as a rule, for these Mamluks who left us a graduation copy, that graduation copy is the only trace that they have left in history, until I found this manuscript, which is also written by a Qayt al-Sharīfī. Here you see the colophon, Qayt Sharīfī min tabakat al-Burhaniyya al-Maliki al-Ashraf Abu Nasr Qāytbāy, and he gives his name a second time, now with the al added to it, Qayt al-Sharīfī. So this could be a very unique case of one Mamluk leaving 2 traces in history, one his graduation copy and another text that predates his graduation copy. And that will be a very unique case indeed, because this clearly predates the graduation copy. And in fact, I think that these are class notes written by Qayt al-Sharīfī, This manuscript is in fact deals with the introduction to the Muqaddimah of Abu Layth Samarkandi in Arabic, translated into Turkic, and it is followed by a commentary in Arabic and in Turkic. So I guess that Qayt al-Sharīfī was taking an advanced class of the Muqaddimah, and he was taking class notes at the time. And this is the textbook or the class notes of Qayt al-Sharīfī, predating his graduation copy. And that would be a very unique case indeed. Now, as was the case with Mamlūk Bardibak, of course, there is the possibility that we are dealing with two different individuals, but I don't think so, for the very simple reason that Qayt is a very rare Mamluk name. Mamai is a very common name, so it makes sense to assume they were namesakes. For Qayt, that is already a bit less likely. But now I'm already venturing into the realm of the historical novel. I can never corroborate the identity of these two individuals, of course, so I think it's time to wrap things up. Now, one more thing, perhaps. Let us briefly take a look at the flyleaf of these class notes of Qayt al-Sharīfī. There's something very strange going on here. If you take a look at this, these are two Quranic quotations, and they are strangely written. Some letters are joined, as they should, while others are not joined, whereas they should have been joined. So these words are clearly written by somebody who's taking his very first steps in Kitaba, his very first steps in writing Arabic. And of course, what do we all do when we try and learn a new alphabet? We write our own name. And what do we find here? Qāytbāy written twice. So my guess is that these are the class notes of Qayt al-Sharīfī. He graduated, and then his class notes were passed on to a junior fellow of his in the same barracks, Qāytbāy, and he used the flyleaf of Qayt's class notes to try and write his own name. But as I said, this is already part of a brewing historical novel, so I will keep it like that. Kuttābīya, Kuttāb, Mukattibūn. I hope to have told you a little bit about the late Mamluk Sultanic libraries and the people involved in stocking these libraries. I thank you for your attention.